In the late months of 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal had become a graveyard of steel, a place where cruisers, destroyers, and even battleships vanished into the blackness beneath the waves. For 3 months, the United States and Imperial Japan had been locked in a brutal struggle to decide who controlled Henderson Field, the airstrip that dominated the daylight over the Solomon Islands. Whoever held it could reinforce Guadalcanal. Whoever lost it would be pushed out of the South Pacific entirely. By November, the Japanese had already launched multiple nighttime bombardments of Henderson Field, using battleships like Hiei and heavy cruisers whose guns smashed aircraft fuel dumps and runways with terrifying accuracy. Japanese crews were masters of night combat, trained for years in long-range torpedo attacks, using the deadly Type 93 Long Lance, whose range and explosive power far exceeded anything the Americans possessed. The U.S. Navy had already suffered devastating losses at Savo Island, where 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in minutes, off Guadalcanal on the night of November 13, when Hiei and a storm of Japanese destroyers tore apart American screening forces, and again on November 14, during the massive air-sea battles that left both sides bloodied. Yet despite these losses, one fact remained unchanged. The Japanese were determined to neutralize Henderson Field once and for all. To accomplish this, they prepared a final bombardment mission built around the battlecruiser-turned-fast battleship IJN Kirishima, sister ship to Hiei. Supported by cruisers and destroyers, she would steam down Iron Bottom Sound in the darkness of November 14-15 and obliterate the airfield before dawn, allowing troop transports to land unopposed. But this time, the Americans were ready with something Japan had never faced in a battleship duel: radar fire control. Task Force 64, under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, consisted of 2 modern North Carolina-class battleships, USS Washington, BB-56, and USS South Dakota, BB-57, along with 4 destroyers. Lee was one of the U.S. Navy's greatest gunnery minds, a man who understood radar better than almost any commander afloat. He knew that the Japanese advantage at night came from eyesight and torpedoes. But in pitch-black waters, vision meant nothing against the Mark 8 fire control radar mounted on Washington, a system capable of tracking enemy ships with near-daylight precision at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. As TF-64 moved through the ink-dark waters north of Savo Island that night, there was no moon, no stars, no horizon, only blackness. This was exactly the environment Japan believed it owned. Their lookouts were legendary, trained to spot the faintest flicker of a funnel glow or silhouette. Their destroyers carried long lances, the most feared weapons in the Pacific. Their officers believed absolutely in their superiority at night fighting. And based on every engagement so far, they had good reason to. But none of them understood what radar fire control meant. None had ever faced a battleship that could see them before its crew even looked through binoculars. None could imagine a ship firing accurate 16-inch rounds without ever visually sighting the enemy. Washington and South Dakota steamed silently southward, their crews at battle stations, guns trained outboard, radar screens glowing in the dark, plotting solutions on threats no human could yet detect. The destroyers ahead formed a thin anti-torpedo screen, fully aware they were the first to die if they made contact. Meanwhile, Japanese forces under Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake were converging on the same stretch of water, confident they would slip past American patrols and begin their bombardment before midnight. Kondo's plan was textbook: use destroyers to scout, force American ships to reveal themselves, then crush the remaining opposition with Kirishima's 14-inch guns. But this time the Americans were ready with something Japan had never faced in a battleship duel: radar fire control. What happened next would change naval warfare forever. In a few minutes, the ancient art of battleship gunnery, born in smoke, powder, and human eyesight, would be replaced by the cold precision of electronic tracking. For the first time in history, a battleship would use radar alone to detect, engage, and destroy another capital ship in the darkness. The Japanese did not know it yet, but the era of their night-fighting supremacy was already dead, and USS Washington, the only intact U.S. battleship left in Iron Bottom Sound that night, was about to deliver the blow that proved it.
As November 14 turned toward midnight, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound became a void, an expanse of absolute blackness so complete that even trained lookouts could barely distinguish sea from sky. In this darkness, the Imperial Japanese Navy felt invincible. For decades, their doctrine had focused on night fighting. Their officers drilled relentlessly in low-light detection, quick-reaction torpedo launches, and coordinated maneuvers in conditions where most navies simply refused to fight. They believed, correctly based on every battle until now, that night erased America's advantages. But what they did not understand was that the United States had arrived with something that nullified every lesson the Japanese had mastered. A weapon that saw through darkness, a weapon that rendered human eyesight obsolete. That weapon sat deep inside USS Washington, the Mark 8 fire control radar, the most advanced naval targeting system in the world in 1942. To the Japanese, radar was still a primitive detection tool, useful only at close range and unreliable in combat. To the Americans aboard Washington, the Mark 8 was a revelation. Operating at 10-centimeter wavelength with narrow beam resolution, it could distinguish individual ships at distances far beyond what the human eye could ever detect at night. It didn't just tell Washington that an enemy ship existed somewhere ahead. It gave range, bearing, and course so precisely that the battleship's main battery could compute a firing solution without ever seeing its target. It turned Washington into a giant blind predator, one that hunted perfectly in absolute darkness. Shortly after 2300, Japanese formation leader Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake advanced through Iron Bottom Sound with Kirishima and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. His mission? Slip past any American warships, bombard Henderson Field at point-blank range, and allowed troop transports to land safely at dawn. He assumed the Americans were shaken and scattered after 2 nights of brutal fighting. He assumed any surviving U.S. ships could not maneuver or target accurately in pitch-black conditions. He assumed, fatally, that the night still belonged to Japan. But Washington's radar operators were already tracking multiple returns approaching. The Mark 8 drew bright arcs across the oscilloscope, each representing metal hulls slicing through the dark. Operators calmly called out positions. Contact bearing 093, range 18,000 yards, moving south-southeast. They were painting a picture of the battlefield no Japanese admiral could see. Behind Washington steamed USS South Dakota, powerful, but plagued by electrical issues that would soon leave her dangerously exposed. Ahead of both battleships pushed 4 American destroyers, Wake, Preston, Benham, and Gwynn, their captains fully aware that they were the expendable screen. At 23:17, the U.S. destroyers made first contact with the Japanese vanguard. Torpedoes streaked through the darkness, searchlights blazed, gunfire erupted. What followed was chaos. 3 destroyers were blasted apart in minutes, their sacrifices buying Admiral Lee exactly what he needed. The Japanese force was now within striking range of Washington's radar-directed guns. But Washington remained invisible. No searchlights, no visible gun flashes yet. The battleship glided forward through the void, unseen, unheard, unfelt. Kondo could not detect her. His men scanned the black horizon, squinting for silhouettes that did not exist. Their optics were useless, their lookouts blind, their doctrine irrelevant. Inside Washington's plotting room, the radar track sharpened. Operators fed solutions into the Mark 8 computer. The target was identified. Not a cruiser, not a destroyer, but a capital ship moving at high speed. It was Kirishima, rushing forward to finish the wounded South Dakota. The Americans had a perfect firing solution. The Japanese had nothing. Not a bearing, not a glimpse, not even a suspicion. Kondo believed the only American battleship present, the burning silhouette of South Dakota, was already crippled and dying. He didn't know another battleship was approaching silently, guns loaded, radar locked, and within minutes of opening fire. At 005, Washington swung slightly to port, her 9 16-inch guns elevated. Turret crews stood in steel chambers lit only by red battle lamps. Below decks, the plotting teams finalized their solution. Range, 8,400 yards, point blank for a battleship duel. Admiral Lee gave the order Washington had been waiting for all night. Open fire. No one on Kirishima saw Washington. No one on Kirishima knew the American battleship even existed. But Washington saw everything. And in a few minutes, the Japanese Navy would discover that the night, their supposed greatest ally, had turned against them. The age of radar had begun, and Kirishima would be its first capital ship victim.
At 06 hours, the silence over Iron Bottom Sound shattered. From the black shape that no Japanese lookout had ever seen, 9 16-inch guns erupted in a concussion that rolled across the water like a physical shock wave. The flashes revealed Washington's silhouette for only a fraction of a second, just long enough for the nearest Japanese destroyer crews to realize with horror that a fully intact American battleship had been hiding in the dark the entire time. But by then, it was already too late. Inside Washington, the shock of the first salvo knocked dust from bulkheads and sent heat rippling down the barrels. The shells, 2,700-pound armor-piercing giants, arched into the night at nearly Mach 2, guided not by human eyes, but by the unwavering precision of the Mark 8 fire control radar. In the plotting rooms and radar stations deep within the ship, operators watched calmly as the glowing blip marked primary target remained perfectly centered in the solution window. Kirishima never maneuvered fast enough to break lock. She never even saw the first shells coming. At 07 hours, the first hits landed. Lookouts aboard Japanese destroyers saw enormous pillars of fire erupt from Kirishima's starboard side. One shell punched through her forward turret armor and detonated deep within, sending flames gouting skyward. Another blasted into her machinery spaces. A third crippled communications. Officers on Kirishima's bridge screamed for damage control, but Washington was already firing her next salvo. Seconds later, more shells hammered the Japanese battleship. Washington's rate of fire, one full salvo every 30 to 40 seconds, turned the duel into a slaughter. The American gunners worked with cold efficiency, loading charges, ramming shells, adjusting elevation in perfect synchronization with the radar data streaming through the ship's fire control circuits. Downrange, Kirishima staggered under blow after blow. At 08 hours, a direct hit wrecked her steering compartment. The explosion disabled both rudders, freezing them at a hard turn. Kirishima began spinning in a tightening circle, the death spiral of a battleship that could no longer steer. A hit on her aft turret knocked it out completely. Another tore straight through her boiler rooms, dropping steam pressure across the ship. She slowed. She listed. She bled fire from a dozen wounds. Still, she remained blind. Still, she could not see her attacker. All she saw were sudden flashes in the dark miles away, flashes too distant to target with optical rangefinders. Her gunners tried to answer with 14-inch salvos, but they fired at the wrong target, the burning South Dakota. Kirishima never aimed a single shell at Washington. She never had a chance. At 010 hours, Washington fired another radar-perfect salvo. Several hits smashed through Kirishima's bow, bursting compartments and tearing open bulkheads. The Japanese sailors attempting to fight the fires were cut down instantly. Debris rained across the decks, ammunition bins cooked off, flames poured through ventilation ducts. Radar plot on Washington remained steady. Target circling, target slowing, target heavily damaged. Admiral Lee remained composed, issuing corrections as though conducting gunnery practice instead of annihilating a capital ship. At 011 hours, Washington delivered the salvo that sealed Kirishima's fate. Multiple 16-inch rounds slammed into her port side, one punching through her hull below the waterline, ripping a massive gash that flooded engine rooms. Another hit collapsed her forward superstructure, killing officers on the bridge instantly. Kirishima's list increased sharply, first 10 degrees, then 15, then 20. 7 minutes had passed since Washington's first shot. In that time, she had fired 75 rounds of 16-inch and 107 rounds of 5-inch. Radar plotted at least 9 confirmed heavy hits, with contemporary Japanese and American analyses estimating between 9 and 20. For a battleship duel fought in pitch-dark conditions, it was one of the most accurate bombardments in naval history. By 013 hours, Kirishima was finished. Fires consumed her upper decks, steering was gone, boilers were failing, water rushed into her hull. Captain Iwabuchi ordered preparations to abandon ship. The crew attempted counter-flooding to reduce her list, but damage was too severe. Washington disengaged, still unseen by most of the Japanese fleet, slipping back into the night at 26 knots, untouched, unscratched, and fully combat-ready. Kirishima, once a symbol of Japan's naval prestige, lay burning in a widening circle, her last moments illuminated by the fires that Mark 8 radar had ignited. By 03 hours 25 minutes, she rolled over and sank bow first into Iron Bottom Sound. 7 minutes of radar-directed gunfire destroyed a Japanese battleship that could not even locate her attacker. The Japanese admirals who reviewed the battle afterward were stunned not only by the speed of Kirishima's destruction, but by the fact that Washington had never once needed to see her to kill her. It was the end of an era. The night no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to radar.
In the minutes following Washington's last devastating salvo, chaos rippled through the Japanese formation. Destroyer captains yelled into voice tubes for bearings they didn't have, range estimates that were useless, and targets they could not see. Lookouts strained their eyes into the darkness, searching for the phantom battleship that had just torn Kirishima apart. But the sea ahead remained empty. No searchlights, no silhouettes, no muzzle flashes. Washington had vanished as easily as she had appeared, swallowed by the same darkness the Japanese had once considered their greatest weapon. Except now, the night was no longer an ally. It was the camouflage of an enemy they could not touch. Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake, aboard the cruiser Atago, did not initially realize that Kirishima had been mortally wounded. Reports filtered in slowly, conflicting and incomplete. Some claimed Kirishima's steering was malfunctioning. Others said she was circling but still firing. Still others believed South Dakota, blazing from earlier hits, was the only battleship in the fight. Kondo attempted to bring his forces around for another run, but without radar, without visibility, and without reliable communication, the maneuver became disorganized. The Japanese formation fragmented in the dark. Meanwhile, aboard Kirishima, officers attempted to save the ship. Damage control parties rushed through choking smoke to reach ruptured bulkheads, but the flooding was uncontrollable. The engineering crews were trapped in boiler rooms rapidly filling with water. Fires raged across the upper decks. Flames reached ammunition lockers, forcing sailors to jettison shells overboard to prevent explosions. Yet despite the chaos, they still could not identify their attacker. Some crew believed multiple American ships were firing. Others thought airborne flares were marking them for bombardment. The truth, that a single battleship, using radar alone, had delivered nearly all the critical hits, was beyond imagination for men trained in optical range-finding and visual targeting. As Washington slipped northward at flank speed, her radar continued to sweep the area, identifying ships that the Americans chose not to pursue. Washington could have continued the engagement. She still had ammunition, a perfect operational picture, and the technical advantage. But Admiral Lee's priority was the safety of his surviving destroyer and his damaged sister ship, South Dakota, which had barely escaped destruction earlier. Lee understood what the Japanese could not yet grasp. Radar gave him total control of when to fight and when to disappear. So he withdrew, invisible and untouchable. Back near Savo Island, the Japanese destroyers Asagumo, Teruzuki, and Samidare converged on the drifting Kirishima. For the first time, they saw her condition clearly. The great battle cruiser turned fast battleship
was blazing bow to stern, listing severely, her turrets sagging, her aft superstructure mangled beyond recognition. Her rudder was locked, her engines were failing. She was no longer maneuvering, she was dying. Japanese sailors attempted to tow her, but the list increased rapidly, from 10 degrees to 18, then 22. Bulkheads groaned, steam lines ruptured, a compartment collapsed, sending men scrambling up slanted decks. The order was given: abandon ship. As crewmen leapt into the oil-slicked water or climbed down ropes into waiting destroyers, some turned back and stared at the burning hulk with disbelief. Kirishima had engaged American forces twice before in the Guadalcanal campaign. She had survived submarine torpedoes, air attack, and surface combat. But nothing in her long career had come close to this: a one-sided execution in the dark by an enemy she never even visually detected. At 3:25, Kirishima capsized and slipped beneath the waves. The roar of escaping air echoed across the sound, followed by silence. Her wreck would later be found nearly upright on the sea floor, guns frozen in the last direction they had fired, toward the wrong target. When reports reached Rabaul and Tokyo, Japanese admirals were stunned. The immediate question, how could Kirishima lose a gunnery duel at night, had no comforting answer. Their entire night-fighting doctrine, refined over decades, depended on superior optics, coordination, and the unparalleled Type 93 long-lance torpedo. But radar ignored all of that. It erased the advantage of darkness, nullified visual range finding, and turned the night into an American ally. Worse still, Washington had suffered virtually no damage. She walked into a Japanese night ambush environment, delivered a perfect radar-directed strike, and walked out untouched. The psychological shock inside Japan's naval staff was enormous. If a single American battleship could do this in 1942, less than 1 year after Pearl Harbor, what would the U.S. fleet be capable of in 1943 or 1944? Japanese planners realized, too late, that radar had ended their reign as the masters of night combat. Their crews, once the terror of the Pacific after sunset, were now blind hunters in a world where the enemy saw everything. The sinking of Kirishima was not just a tactical defeat. It was a revelation, a warning. The Pacific War had entered a new age, and Japan had no answer for it.
By the dawn of November 15, 1942, as the smoke drifted across Iron Bottom Sound and the waters calmed once more, the U.S. Navy realized it had just won something that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War. A clean, decisive, one-on-one battleship duel, the last of its kind in American naval history, and one that marked the end of Japan's mastery of the night sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy, from its admirals in Rabaul to the staff planners in Tokyo, woke to an unthinkable reality. A single American battleship, assisted by radar alone, had destroyed one of their capital ships in 7 minutes without being seen. For decades, the Japanese had built their naval doctrine on the belief that night operations would be their trump card in any war with the United States. They had invested immense effort into training lookouts, perfecting torpedo tactics, and drilling coordinated attacks under moonlight or total darkness. Their victories at Savo Island, Tassafaranga, and the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal had reinforced that belief. American sailors had been slaughtered before they even understood what was happening. But Washington's destruction of Kirishima overturned every foundational assumption the Japanese held. When the after-action reports reached Vice Admiral Kondo and later Admiral Yamamoto himself, the shock was profound. Kirishima did not merely lose a gunnery duel, she was annihilated by an enemy she never detected. The Japanese learned that Washington had fired radar-directed salvos with almost daylight accuracy, while Kirishima fired entirely on optical guesswork, hitting South Dakota by accident, but never once correctly identifying the real threat.
The Mark 8 radar had made rangefinders, searchlights, and visual spotting obsolete. Worse still, the Americans had mastered its use far earlier than Japanese intelligence had imagined. Tokyo's high command held internal discussions that bordered on disbelief. How could a ship relying entirely on electronics outfight their best-trained night gunners? How could a U.S. battleship engage at 8,400 yards in pitch blackness without visual confirmation? How had their long-lance torpedoes, the pride of the fleet, never even been launched at Washington? The answers were humiliating. The Americans had entered a new era of naval warfare. Japan had not. Meanwhile, in the United States, Washington's triumph electrified the Navy. For sailors who had endured months of defeat in the Solomon Islands, the victory was proof that America could stand toe-to-toe with Japan's best. The crew of Washington, who had trained relentlessly under Admiral Willis A. Lee, knew exactly what had happened. Radar had given them the equivalent of perfect vision in a world designed for blindness. Gunnery teams who once relied on spotting splashes through haze or moonlight were now adjusting their aim solely based on the calm, unerring feedback of radar screens. Generations of naval tradition had just been rewritten with the turn of a dial and the rotation of an antenna. The strategic consequences of the battle were immediate and decisive. With Kirishima gone and he already sunk in the previous night's action, Japan had lost both of its fast battleships in the Solomons, ships that had been crucial for night bombardment missions against Henderson Field. Without them, Japanese forces could no longer reliably suppress the airfield. Without suppression, they could no longer land reinforcements safely. And without reinforcements, the Guadalcanal campaign, which had cost Japan thousands of elite aviators, sailors, and infantry, was effectively lost. In Tokyo, the realization cut deep. The IJN had entered the Pacific War with a force of highly trained elite sailors who were the product of decades of specialized preparation. But by late 1942, attrition at Guadalcanal had hollowed out their destroyer squadrons, drained their cruiser divisions, and cost them irreplaceable officers. Kirishima's sinking symbolized more than the loss of a ship. It symbolized the collapse of Japan's entire night-fighting doctrine and the rise of an American fleet that fought with technology rather than tradition. Washington's victory also marked the final battleship versus battleship duel in U.S. history. Never again would two capital ships meet on open water and settle a fight with big guns alone. Aircraft carriers, radar-guided gunnery, and submarines would dominate the rest of the war. Washington's battle was the last breath of an old era, ending in a blaze of radar-lit destruction. For the men who survived aboard Kirishima, the memory was haunting. Some insisted until their deaths that they never saw the American battleship. Others recalled the sensation of shells smashing through steel at impossible angles, landing with unerring accuracy that made no sense under traditional gunnery rules. They later learned the truth. The Washington gunners could see them in ways no human eye ever could. For American sailors, the night became a symbol of newfound strength. The darkness that had once terrified them during the early months of the war had become a terrain they now owned. Radar transformed the battlefield into a sphere of invisible awareness where the enemy's greatest advantage counted for nothing. And so, as Kirishima slipped beneath the water at 03:25 and Washington sailed north, unwounded, unchallenged, and triumphant, the course of the Pacific War changed. No longer would Japan dictate the terms of night combat. No longer would the U.S. Navy fight blind. No longer would darkness be the domain of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On that night, in 7 relentless minutes, USS Washington proved a truth that Japanese admirals never imagined possible. The age of the battleship had ended, and the age of radar had begun.